Today, we will be discussing an issue that you all have probably heard plenty about, but you might not know the whole story. Let's talk about going green, or else. This video will be divided into 3 key parts. First, we will delve into what renewable energy really is in our modern society and how we use it. Then, we will break it down even further by examining the statistics of 8 key countries around the world, their progress in the switch to renewable energy, and their change in CO2 emissions. Finally, we will wrap it up with an analysis on why all of these numbers really matter. Part 1. What is energy? Earth. We all call it home. We live, work, and play day in and day out in our rapidly advancing modern world. But all of that activity requires something to keep it in motion. Energy. It powers our lights, runs our cars, heats our buildings. And with the world's rapidly growing population, we use a lot of it. Energy production has increased exponentially over the past few decades and is still continuing to rise. And we are discovering that all that production has harmful effects on our lovely planet. If we don't do something, it is only going to get worse from here on out. To prevent things from spiraling further, there is a fundamental concept we all need to understand. The energy we create is not all the same. In simplest terms, we currently use 2 different types of energy production around the world: non-renewable energy and renewable energy. Non-renewable energy is a resource that cannot be readily replaced by natural means at a quick enough pace to keep up with consumption. In other words, we are using it faster than we are making it. On the other hand, renewable energy is a resource that is replaced rapidly by a natural process within a human lifetime. Power generated from the sun is a good example of this. Oil, coal, natural gas, and nuclear are examples of non-renewable energy. These 3 are also known as fossil fuels, and they release CO2 emissions in their production. Solar, wind, hydro, biowaste, ocean, and geothermal are forms of renewable energy. They are considered clean in their production and do not release CO2 emissions. Each year, the world uses different percentages of each of these forms of energy to produce its power. This is known as the World Energy Balance. At present in 2018, 26% of the world's energy balance is renewable. Here is an overview of the total energy balance for the world in 2018. Non-renewables are dominating the board at 74%. Hydropower is the most used form of renewable energy, while the other forms barely make a drop in the bucket. We are headed in the right direction, but there is still so much more we can do. Part 2. Where have we improved? Now that we know the current numbers, let's take a look at what got us here over the past decade. From 2005 to 2016, the use of renewable energy increased by only 5% worldwide. At the same time, since 2005, global CO2 emissions have risen steadily by 23%. The only silver lining here is that in the last year or so, the consistent 2% annual rise has dropped back down to less than 1%. A good sign. These are the top 8 energy-consuming countries in the world today, using a whopping collective of 8,314 megatos of energy last year. I'll now show you the change from 2005 to 2016 in both these countries' use of renewable energy as well as their CO2 emissions. Let's get up close to these numbers to see the changes. To kick us off, we have China. China is currently the #1 consumer of energy in the world. They did pretty good increasing their renewables. However, with their booming industry and population, their CO2 emissions went up instead of down. Next up is the US of A. The United States focused more on reducing their carbon emissions than they did on their renewables in the past decade. But who could blame them when they had the highest emission rate out of all 8 countries, and still do? In spot number 3, we have India. Very similar to China's numbers, India saw an increase in both renewables and CO2 emissions. Up next is Russia. For Russia, it's almost slow and steady wins. They had one of the lowest increases in renewables over the last decade, but they also saw a decrease in emissions, so baby steps in the right direction. Ranked 5th in energy consumption, Japan did fairly well upping its renewable energy, while also managing to lower their carbon emissions. Must be doing something right. They might be taking notes from the next country on the list. Germany dominated with the largest increase in renewable energy usage, upping their number by a good 14%. Managing to lower their CO2 emissions as well, you could call it a win-win. Second to last, we have South Korea at number 7 in energy usage. Anything is better than nothing as they increased their overall renewable usage to 2%. However, it wasn't enough to offset the rise they also saw in CO2 emissions. Finally, we have Brazil. First and foremost, Brazil had the highest percentage of renewable energy of all 8 countries due to their use of hydropower. Unfortunately, over the past decade, their energy balance shifted, and they were the only country to drop in renewable usage. Along with an increase in CO2 emissions, they might want to look at backtracking. These numbers can start to give us an idea of how renewable energy and CO2 emissions are related, and they show that the leaders in energy consumption are beginning to shift their energy balances towards more renewable and sustainable resources. Part 3. Why should you care? All the data and statistics in the world are pointless if you don't know why it is that they are important. This shift between renewable and non-renewable energy usage and fluctuations in CO2 emissions affects us all. The use of non-renewable energy resources, such as fossil fuels, increases the emission of greenhouse gases, like CO2, into the atmosphere. These gases trap heat in the upper atmosphere and cause the lower atmosphere and the surface of the Earth to warm at an unnatural rate. This is known as global warming. This rapid increase in temperature has a number of adverse effects on our planet. Rising sea levels, ocean acidification, melting polar ice caps, altering weather patterns are just a few changes scientists have accredited to climate change. The use of renewable energy in place of fossil fuels is just one of the ways we can decrease CO2 emissions before it's too late. To learn more about Going Green and what you can do to get involved, please visit www.gogreen.org. Thank you for listening.